Hey everyone, and welcome to Meet the Prof. I'm Shane, and my friend Spence Hackney and I take questions from college students, and we ask them to Christian professors with the goal of encouraging Christ-centered conversations on the college campus. So thank you for joining us. It is great to have you with us. We don't take that lightly, and you'll have the privilege of hearing an interview now with Jonathan Kladder. Jonathan is a professor of music education at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, and I have a special request now for this one. So would you please go on wherever app you're listening to this, and would you leave us a comment or a review? Apparently that'll really help also get this to more college students. So the interview we have with Jonathan Kladder is just part one of our interview, and I think you're really going to enjoy getting to hear from him. So without any further ado, here's my interview with Jonathan Kladder. Well, Jonathan, it is so great to have you on the podcast now. Thank you for joining us. And how are you doing today?
I'm good. I did not rap in class today, so that was a nice refresher for me. I'm good. So thanks for having me as well.
Well, you must explain to the listeners then what this is that you do in rapping for your students. Because as we're recording this is the first week of class. So some of your students just met you one time or two times, I guess.
Yeah, and I'll also be honest, it was the first time I ever rapped in class, if we're going to talk about it. So, I think, from day one with students is I'm trying to build a classroom environment where they feel that they can take risks, that they can be real with me. And I tell them all the time that I'm a human. And they can come talk to me about things that are going on, whether it's class related or not, so that I can help encourage them and or point them to a person who can help them if I'm not able to. So we do introductions, and I did an icebreaker, and we created some beats with music technology because that's the class. So I did some MIDI sequencing. We created a little beat, and then I rapped my introduction to the class. And then just I was very embarrassed by the time it was done because it was a horrible rap, and I cannot rap at all, but I did do it.
Did you have it memorized ahead of time what you're going to do?
It was totally
extemporaneous.
Totally
on the best.
And I got some applause and some laughter, and I think you could kind of feel a little bit the classroom environment just kind of felt to just the pressure and the tension of like, it's the first class of the day. It's the first class of the semester for most of them. I think they just could kind of feel the pressure ease off, the tension ease off.
Yeah.
And we laughed and we goofed and we had fun. So it was great.
That's for a lot of us and the listeners. I think that would be our worst nightmare. It's sort of like someone putting you on stage, saying, tell a joke or just sing a song. Like to do a rap is even harder.
Yeah, definitely.
That's great. Well, so I have another question about you. So there's an article that I found. I've known you for a couple of years, but I didn't know this till I was preparing for the interview. And there's an article that you wrote that describes you in the title somewhere of a punk rocker turned teacher. So were you a punk rocker? Tell us, what are you talking about there?
Yeah, disclaimer, I did write that ethnography so that, just to remove any bias potentially that's there if you do actually look up the article, whoever's watching this. But I just wanted to basically, it was therapeutic a bit for me to be able to write and describe experiences for me as a musician growing up, kind of in where I live in my field, which is music and music education. And so most music that when you think of kind of like formal music learning typically is classical music. It's typically Western European music. It's typically composed by, to be quite frank, white male composers. And it is very formal in its stance of band, orchestra, and choir. Typically, that's generally what you think of with music. And so the autoethnography for me was a place and a space to put my story. I was a closeted punk rocker, and by what I mean is, I played saxophone in band in 6th and 7th grade and 8th grade. And I would go home secretly and not practice my saxophone, but I would take out my guitar And I would put in, and back then, of course, I'm dating myself, we had cassette tapes. This was before CDs. And I would pop my cassette tapes in my stereo in my bedroom, and I taught myself how to play the whole Green Day Dookie album. I will have to just be completely transparent. I think that's one of the albums that I learned how to play guitar through.
Wow.
And then Blink 182, Enema of the State is another one. That was the one that taught me how to play bass guitar. So I taught myself how to play a bass guitar that way too, and then started punk rock bands. And we were playing gigs where I was locally living at that point in time. And ironically, quit band because I didn't want to play the music on the page. I didn't want somebody to tell me what to play. You know what I mean? It wasn't explorative. It wasn't really creative. I wasn't able to write my own music in band class. I had to kind of do what the band director told me to do. And so playing punk rock kind of offered some autonomy for me as a musician, and allowed me to learn at a pace that worked for me. Outside of the classroom. And then ironically, of all things, I quit band. But then in college, I wanted to major in music, but I couldn't be a punk rocker because there was no place really to be a punk rocker in a formal institutional landscape that didn't exist. And most of the curriculum actually still doesn't exist for a lot of places. So I picked up my saxophone, and I learned how to play 5-page, 6-page saxophone sonatas. Classical repertoire, and graduated with a degree in music ed, and I became a band director for 10 years.
How ironic. Gone full circle.
Back in full circle. And after about 9 or 10 years, I'm like, why? I just feel like I'm a poser. Like, I can teach band and it's fine. And it's about, for me, it was more like, why did I go to education? It was the relationship with students. And what I became more aware of was how much I didn't really kind of identify myself as a band director. I identified myself more as a popular musician, music performer and player, and got my grad work done at USF. And that's where I really felt like I could come out of the closet, and like it was okay for me to talk about me being a punk rocker. And that it was kind of like more of a safe place to say, like, I play this type of music, not so much this type of music, and feel validated and feel like, guess what? There are actually a lot of other students who feel the same way that I did. And so allowing students now at UNCW to feel like they have a professor who recognizes and is educated in classical Western European music, but also is a popular musician and plays guitar and plays punk rock and plays ska and plays whatever, but they can feel like they can be real about their music that they're interested with. So
do you ever see sort of a shock in their eyes when they first learn, like, here's Dr. Kladder, married, has 2 kids, and he loves punk rock music?
I think so, but on the first day of class, in addition to rapping, we when they all were sitting down in the room and it was totally quiet, right? I go to the back to the computer and I pull up AC/DC Back in Black. I crank it up, and they all look at each other like, "What is going on right now?" And then we body drummed. We learned how to play the Back in Black drum piece. Like they body drummed it, and we learned how to drum from there. And I think from then on, they're like, okay, this guy is different. This is not typically how I might have thought my first day of class would have gone. But like today, we were working on some other popular music. So like I'm using lots of different artists all the time in the classroom, and it's not classical music. So I think now that, they feel, I think they look at me and it feels kind of normal, and if it doesn't, that's okay. They get used to it.
Do you feel like you're helping create an experience or an atmosphere for music students that you wish you would have had when you came into college? You said you were looking for.
Yeah, 100%. 100%, Shane. When you think of, and I didn't talk about this, but like my middle school career as a closeted musician allowed me to be a church musician. And so like, ironically, learning Green Day Dookie's album taught me how to play guitar and bass guitar, which then translated for me into be able to be a church musician and be able to play with the bands on stage for the weekends services. And stylistically, and I say this is also ironic, is that the music styles actually were quite similar to each other, and that they were pretty progressive, very contemporary in the church that I ended up actually working and I became a worship director for about 6 years at that church. So those two worlds, although like morally and ethically are so opposed to each other, ironically, it's interesting how it helped support me in my skill development to be able to actually play and lead people to worship in worship services at church, right? But I definitely think, to your point, is all of it connects to the dots to like allowing students to feel like, okay, this is a safe place. I can learn with this professor. The music that I listen to, he validates and understands my perspective because he didn't have that place when he was in his undergrad. And I talk to my students about that from time to time. They'll ask me in class, or I'll bring it up because it relates to something that we're talking about specific to content or the curriculum. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it really is. It's really cool to come full circle and now be able to create spaces for students to be able to do that.
I bet. So, Jonathan, I heard someone say one time that a lot of the worship music has been influenced by the band U2, one of my favorite bands.
Yeah.
So is that true? And what does that mean?
I think it's true. I mean, I don't know that I've really contemplated or thought about that very much, but stylistically, if you think about how most worship services exist in a lot of churches across a lot of denominations now, whether it be Baptist, Christian Reform, non-denominational, I mean, the entourage is quite wide. There's always, of course, the traditional kind of hymn and organ approach to music and worship, which I also grew up with before I ended up switching churches with my parents, and it was more contemporary. But I mean, if you think about the style, right, of YouTube, of the electric guitar leads, of the guitar solos, of the drums and the synths, right, and the bass guitars and all the parts work, and even the basic song structure of like there's an intro, there's a verse, there's a chorus, there's a verse, there's a bridge and an outro. All of that is very, U2-ish.
Okay.
So I would say absolutely. Maybe some of the listeners have more perspective on that than I do, but I would definitely think there's an influence there. Yeah,
that's good. That's good to hear. Good to understand. Well, so you described the sum of your parents and you growing up in church. What was your spiritual journey like as you headed into college? Because on meettheprof.com, it sounds like you became a Christian pretty young.
I did.
What was it like in college?
Yeah, I was born and raised in a Christian family. I call it the powerhouse Christian trifecta, in that, school for me was Christian all the way through elementary, middle, high, and ironically, even collegiately. I went to a private Christian school. And then also church, right? So attending churches on the weekends, being connected to youth group, and then, of course, home. For me, was a very Christian, nurturing environment. So
school, church, and home.
Yeah, absolutely. The trifecta, which was super great. I think it taught me a lot about biblical principles, what Jesus talks about in the New Testament, how we should live our lives and acting that out. And I think everything connected pretty well through all of those three trifecta places for me. So when I was about 6th grade, I made profession of faith. I was born and raised in the Christian Reformed Church, so we did infant baptism. So I was baptized an infant, and then you do profession of faith, which is whenever you're ready to take that, that next step in announcing and what you believe in. And so I did that in 6th grade, and then I would say, all the way through even into college. I think college is where I started to, I wouldn't say waver, but ask more questions about, what does it mean to be a believer? I would say I was very much part of like homogenous groups kind of growing up. So I was born and raised in West Michigan, which was a very Dutch, which is not a problem. I'm Dutch, but very Christian saturated environments, as far as churches on every single corner. Everyone went to church on Sundays. You don't cut your grass on Sunday. Just following principles and things like that. And it was just, I was saturated with it all the way through. So I think finally, when I got to the collegiate level, I think that's when, I started to have more questions and, really start to poke and pry a little bit more in my faith and really kind of push myself and what do I believe and why do I believe what I believe and how does it all interconnect and what does it mean for me in college at the university level. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah. Well, so can you give another example of one of the questions that you wrestled with in college? Maybe you think one of the more significant questions?
Yeah, I think one of the questions of the many questions was a wrestling that I had because I had a really good friend who he was kind of like he's like grown up in the church, Christian family, Christian school, but eventually kind of had left the faith entirely. And his whole position was like, if God is so good and so loving, why do we see the pain and the suffering? Why do we see the hurt? Why do we see the death? Right? Why, if God is that, then why? Right? And we all have our answers and we can, that's been wrestled and debated and talked about for a long time. And his fundamental belief came down and we would debate this and talk about it. And it really made me think a lot about, yeah, you're right. So like for him, it was like, if you're a good person, just generally a good person, and you're kind and you are following biblical principles, but you're not necessarily professing that you are a Christian, does that person really end up actually dying and then going to hell versus heaven? And this whole wrestling and pulling of back and forth of what it means for the broader community of those that are good, right, but don't believe necessarily. So I think, that was one of the larger things that I think I wrestled with. There were periods of time in college and university where, there was a closeness that I felt and I could feel the Holy Spirit. And then there were times where it's kind of like you're in the desert and you don't really feel the Holy Spirit. Right. And that ebbing and flowing of feeling close and not feeling close. And I think there were questions sometimes too of like going through things that were difficult and hard and feeling like you're calling out to God, but you're not getting an answer.
Yeah.
And I think my questions were why?
Yeah.
And now 40, I look back, I think you can kind of see, it's obviously a hindsight 2020, looking backwards, you can kind of see God's provision in his hand through all of it. But I think those were some of the bigger questions that I worked with.
Thank you. What would you offer as being maybe one point that helped answer both those questions for you, that was more significant for you? So this question about those who would die and go to hell, especially if they had professed Christ at one point, and then the question about feeling God's closeness come and go.
I think the closeness of coming and going is, for me, that's relationships, and we're humans. And I think there are periods of time where, I can look back and see, okay, I think maybe God pulled back for a while because he was waiting for me to push in.
What do you mean? Push?
But I mean, push into my relationship with God. So instead of saying, I'll wait for you, God, like, I'm just going to stand here and I'm going to live my life. And when you're ready to push back into me, you know what I mean? Like, it's on your terms, but thanks. I'm good. Versus like, I think that might be him saying, it's your turn.
Okay.
Keep pushing on me.
Like a normal relationship.
Yeah. And what I mean by pushing is seeking into, you know what I mean?
Uh-huh.
Whether that's reading the scriptures or more prayer, or more mindfulness, and, devotion time, one-on-one time.
Yeah.
And what I've found for me is like when I do that and I'm diligent and I'm obedient and I'm patient,
Mm-hmm.
can sometimes be super hard, right?
Oh, yeah.
Where you just want an answer and you want an answer now. I'm a very impatient person. So that's something that God's really worked on me is patience. But being able to have that space and time to be able to just push in to him and ask for the Holy Spirit for clarity, and get that answer. And when he's ready and when it's time, he's there, So yeah, I think that's one.
That's
as
helpful.
far as, your other question is, I just go to the scriptures. When you read the New Testament and you read the mission and you see what Jesus lived for and how he modeled his life and what he said specifically, I take that at point blank, as far as believing in him and those that believe him and follow him. The path is narrow if you find it, but that's the way.
He said that.
Yeah. So that for me is just the constant reminder of like, I feel like there's so much today of like deconstruction of faith that's happening and people taking truths away from the Bible and making them into what they want them to be. And I just think that's super dangerous. And for me, it's just always staying to what does the scripture say? What you know what I mean? And 9 times out of 10, the scriptures will give you your answer, I believe personally. But
I appreciate you going there because I don't think we've explored many questions of the faith in the podcast so far. And I think that could be very helpful to students to hear how others have had some of the same questions they had or they have currently. So thanks for explaining that.
Yeah.
Well, so will you tell me what it was like for you when you were going to grad school, like a regular grad school and then PhD, especially coming out of a Christian everything, the trifecta, but one of those being Christian school all the way through undergrad, but then to go to, you said USF's where you got your PhD, University of South Florida, and you were in Boston for a while too, weren't you?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I've thought about it off and on, but I haven't really delved too much into the experiences of those. And ironically too, like I got my undergraduate degree in music education from Hope College, which is a small private Christian college in Western Michigan.
Okay.
And my first job actually, and the job I kept until grad school, was actually at Grand Rapids Christian School.
Started right off working in Christian environment.
Continued. Yeah, and it was great because it was a great environment for me to grow as a teacher. It was a place where I would help lead the praise and worship team, for our chapels, and I could pray with students, and it was cool.
Yeah.
So grad school was for me, and my Boston University degree is actually online, so I was physically not there in person.
Okay.
So my PhD program was the first time, essentially, that I really had. Not only did I leave the Christian school completely behind and be a part of an institution that was, of course, secular, for lack of a better word to explain it. But I also moved across the country, right? So the first time we had actually left West Michigan. So that's like a whole nother piece of the puzzle.
Right.
Like, whoa, what is happening right now? We're not in West Michigan anymore, are we? There's not a church on every single corner. So yeah, I think the PhD program for me challenged me in what it meant to be still a Christian, still living a life that Jesus had called me to, but realizing there's academic freedom to some degree, but not pushing my faith, but allowing students to see who I was in the classroom. And also, as a student in a classroom, as a PhD program in the program, like the colleagues and peers that I was working through, just letting them know that I was a Christian, and that's here's what I do believe. And, it's not assumed. It's not assumed that I'm a Christian because I'm not teaching in a Christian school, or I'm not, at a Christian private school, attending school. So I think it really, in a good way, really pushed me to be, I think, more aware of being a light for God's kingdom, being, I think, stronger in my faith and challenging me to grow in such a secular kind of environment. Interestingly, though, like my PhD mentors, 2 or 3 of them were Christians.
Yeah.
Crazy, but ended up being the truth. So I ended up doing gigs in churches with the professors that ended up being on my dissertation committee. Another crazy.
Is ironic.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
But God works through those ways. I think He gave me what I needed and gave me the space to feel like, okay, I'm not completely alone, right? As a Christian in this institution, and there are others who are also Christians, and He would open those doors. And that was helpful for me, to be honest, to know that I had, colleagues and peers, a couple that were Christians, and then also, 2 or 3 of the professors that were mentors of mine also be Christian.
Well, if I was going to take music in college again, Jonathan is the teacher I would like to have. So thankful for Jonathan, and you'll hear part 2 of our interview with Jonathan next week. If you are a college student, will you go and find us on Instagram and follow us on Meet the Prof Official, and you can even leave the question there for professors. And if you are a Christian professor, would you go to meettheprof.com and consider leaving a profile, making a profile where you leave your testimony there? That would be awesome to let students get to know about you that way. Before we go, if you would please remember to like or subscribe, and remember my request at the beginning of the podcast, would you leave a comment or a review? It can be a little tricky at first, but if you look on whatever app you're using, there should be some place to leave a little comment, and it could just be 1 sentence. Thank you so much for listening. And if you would like to support this ministry financially, thank you for that. And you can give online at give.cru.org/0424344. So until next time, we hope this encourages you to have a Christ-centered conversation on your college campus.